everyone. This is Brian Eiler. I'm the director of the Stimson Center Southeast Asia program. We're going to begin very shortly when the room populates. Well, good morning and good evening from wherever you are. This is Brian Eiler. I'm the director of the Stimson Center Southeast Asia program. And today we're going to explore the intersection of two issue areas that the Southeast Asia program here at the Stimson Center is very passionate about. One is war legacies, and second is the environment. And these two issue areas are going to be explored by members and friends of the War Legacies Working Group, which is housed at the Stimson Center. And the War Legacies Working Group is a membership-based working group that works to address the challenges related to legacies of war, namely addressing issues related to Agent Orange, as well as unexploded ordnance and mining and demining awareness in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and those war legacy issues that were introduced by the United States actions, military actions in mainland Southeast Asia 50 years ago. We're going to be looking at how war legacies issues affect the environment in Southeast Asia, as well as climate change, namely extreme weather, really begins to take hold in the region. How does this new factor impact the abilities of member organizations that from the War Legacies Working Group and others that are active in addressing legacies of wars affect their work? To facilitate our conversation, we've asked Charles Bailey to moderate. Charles Bailey is the author of a really important book called From Enemies to Partners, Vietnam, the United States, and Agent Orange. He's the co-author with his fellow co-author, Legacies. This book came out about 4 years ago, and I encourage you all to read it as a good start on learning about legacies of war. Charles is an executive committee member of the War Legacies Working Group and an advisor on the Agent Orange project at the Aspen Institute. From 2011 to 2014, Charles Bailey was the director of the Agent Orange in Vietnam program at the Aspen Institute. And prior to these roles, Charles held various positions for the Ford Foundation, including most recently as the director for a special initiative on Agent Orange dioxin. And recently, Charles, as being located in Whatcom County in the northwestern state of Washington, has been appointed by his city council to a committee to advise the local government on their own climate action plan. So Charles is probably the best fit person I could think to moderate this event. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Charles. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. And Brian, thank you for that introduction. Yesterday's Wall Street Journal carried this front page headline: "War in Ukraine could have environmental impact that lasts decades." The article begins, "The war in Ukraine is poisoning the nation's air, water, and soil, with environmental health experts saying pollutants released by the continuing assault could take years to clean up while raising the risk of cancer and respiratory ailments, as well as developmental delays in children." It goes on to note the potential health impacts could reach beyond Ukraine's borders. This report is certainly reminiscent of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia 60 years ago. What we've learned from that conflict is that the consequences of war linger on long after the fighting stops. They extend in space and they spread in time. These three Southeast Asian countries are still dealing, each in its own way, with the environmental impacts of the war. At least today in Ukraine, the Wall Street Journal notes, there are local and international NGOs, quote, combing through eyewitness posts on social media and messaging platforms such as Telegram, and cross-referencing those with satellite images and Google Earth maps to document contamination sites in real time. I read this with amazement. Such organizations and technologies, of course, didn't exist 60 years ago, It's only with much effort in recent decades that we have gained some idea of the fate of the dioxin in Agent Orange and where the bombs fell in Vietnam. We still know too little about the fate of these munitions in both Laos and Cambodia. Progress on war legacies in Southeast Asia has been led by progress in the post-war relationship between Vietnam and the US. The Vietnam War lasted 20 years, and for the next 20 years, the US held Vietnam under an embargo and there was little contact. Progress on war legacies was slow. In fact, it has taken 36 years to come into some kind of alignment on the full spectrum of war legacies: Americans missing in action, unexploded ordnance, Agent Orange, and Vietnam's own missing in action. We hope Laos and Cambodia can leapfrog this timeline for Agent Orange and UXOs. Today, we know that an assault on the environment is an assault on people, whether the assault is from the residuals of war, industrial pollution, or a growing reservoir of excess carbon in the atmosphere, leading to climate change. The key is to reduce vulnerability, especially for those who live with the greatest disadvantages. Agent Orange destroyed forests on a large scale, and its dioxin residue still contaminates a former US air base in Vietnam. Unexploded ordnance is widespread and continues to stymie productive use of land in many areas. Large numbers of people are living with disabilities from accidental contact with UXO, or because a parent or grandparent or even a great-grandparent was once exposed to dioxin. Today, we go deeper into one of these legacies, unexploded ordnance, with our four outstanding panelists: Claire Juncker, Sarah Kulabdara, Erin Lin, and Doug Weir. Claire Juncker is the Executive Director of Peace Trees Vietnam. She has worked for nonprofit administrative and leadership positions for over a decade, and for the last 7 years at Peace Trees, the Seattle-based NGO. Peace Trees has focused for the last 25 years on humanitarian mine action in Vietnam. Claire leads program development, strategy, operations, and advancement with frequent visits to Vietnam. Sarah Kulabdara serves as Executive Director of Legacies of War. Legacies of War is the only international US-based advocacy and educational organization working to address the impacts of the American secret war in Laos and the neighboring conflicts in Cambodia and Vietnam. Legacies of War operates programs to remove unexploded ordnance and assist UXO victims in Laos. Erin Lin is an assistant professor of political science and global food politics at The Ohio State University and a member of the American Board of the Mine Action Group. Her research deals with post-conflict reconstruction, political geography, food security, and legacies of war, with particular focus on Southeast Asia. Doug Weir began researching and advocating against the polluting legacy of armed conflicts and military activities in 2005. He founded the Conflict and Environmental Observatory to monitor and raise awareness of the environment and humanitarian consequences of conflicts. The observatory also documents the military contributions to the climate crisis through its online platform dedicated to improving the reporting of data on emissions from military operations. Let's begin with Claire.
Thank you, Charles, for that kind introduction. I'm grateful to be with all of you today. I'm especially grateful to meet some fellow panelists for the first time, and I read your work and understand that you have a lot to teach us, so thank you very much for being here today. Charles, you gave a nice introduction to Peace Trees. I'll flesh that out just a little bit. Peace Trees Vietnam was founded on the Day of Normalization between the US and Vietnam in 1995 to begin building bridges of trust and understanding between the people of our countries. And our first act of partnership was to begin work in humanitarian demining alongside the people of Quang Tri province, where very little mine action, very little work addressing the physical consequences of war that remain after all those years had been started. So there was and is a lot of work to do. One of the questions that I considered as we're preparing for this conversation today is how much has been done and how much is left to do. Many years ago, those in the room who remember the number of years that we thought it would take to clear land in Vietnam and make the province specifically of Quang Tri safe was 300 years. Quang Tri province was the northernmost province in former South Vietnam. It, among several other central provinces, were the sites of very heavy fighting. And Quang Tri was the first place to really begin aggressive, coordinated mine action. And because of that, that notional number of 300 has dropped significantly down to even 10 years might be possible to bring Quang Tri to a level of safety. Other central provinces have not had quite as much demining, in some cases very little. But we know that this example of Quang Tri can be, those lessons learned can be brought to other central provinces, and hopefully be in a position to bring Vietnam to a level of safety in the foreseeable future. All 63 provinces in Vietnam remain contaminated. 19 of 63 provinces are significantly contaminated. And Vietnam has experienced unsafe land for a long time. That goes without saying. And now here in the year 2022, as we continue these efforts and really are sort of at the precipice for expanding to really bring the models that have worked in a few provinces to those other 19 provinces that need significant mine action attention, climate change and environmental matters are going to have a greater and greater impact on our ability to work effectively, and also the strategies we might want to take forward in order to support and advance our work as well as possible. So that's a summary from my side, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you. I think we will save questions until after all of the opening remarks. So let's turn to Sarah. Sarah?
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for all of you for tuning in. And it's such an honor and a privilege to be part of this wonderful panels of friends, which, I'm so honored to call you all friends, and thank you all for the work that you do. Like you, Claire, I also follow all of your work and with admiration, and really appreciate having just an army of colleagues doing the great work that needs to be done. So for today, we're really, covering just the negative impacts that UXO and other explosives have on the environment. So what I like to do is just talk specifically about Laos, the current problems that Laos faces, and how the negative impacts of the environment lingers on. And I would be remiss if I didn't add that the legacies of war is multidimensional. It impacts every single aspect of the people's lives, the people of Laos's lives, as well as many of the diaspora community that have fled, like my own family. So first, to give you all some context for those who may not be as familiar with Laos, Laos is a very tiny land-linked country in Southeast Asia. It borders 5 countries, Vietnam, Cambodia, Myanmar, Thailand, and China. It has a population of roughly 7.7 million people. And the dominant sector in Laos is agriculture, which accounts for about 20% of Laos's GDP, and furthermore, 70% of employment for the people of Laos. Major trades include rice, bananas, and my favorite, sugarcane. Now, with 17 out of the 18 provinces suffering from the impacts of UXO contamination, that means that this puts a huge toll on Laos's economy, not to mention the people. While there are many, many types of bombs, ranging from pineapple bombs to 1,000-pound bombs, the biggest problem that Laos faces are the cluster bombs. This accounts for about 50% of what deminers find and are clearing today. There's an estimated 80 million of these cluster bombs left behind from the war that Charles mentioned that happened about 50 years ago. So this means that about 1/3 of Laos is contaminated and the land is deemed to be unsafe and not safe to be released for use. This also means that the contaminated areas pose danger to the people as well as visitors to Laos. 50,000 people have been killed or injured since 1964. And in the last decade alone, 54% of the people injured or harmed are under the age of 18, so they're children. Despite our best efforts, 1% of the contaminated area have been cleared. To give you all just a better picture of what the contaminated areas, this 1/3 of Laos looks like, it's about 8 times the size of Washington, DC. So think of it as Washington, DC being bombed 8 times. So with 1% being cleared so far, this may not seem like a lot of progress, but it is something that we should be celebrating because that's 1% less that we have to clear. Demining is hard work. It takes a lot of time, it's tedious, and it's dangerous. The breadth of the problem in Laos is so huge, and we have to celebrate these little wins. And I'm proud of the number of accidents that have tremendously dropped. Legacy started our advocacy effort in 2008. And back then, each year there were about 300 numbers of accidents from UXO. Today, due to sustained funding, deminers are able to conduct clearance efforts, mine risk education, and that number of accidents in the past 5 years has gone to less than 50 a year. And that's something that we should be really, really proud of. Now today, the current level of funding for Laos is at 45 million. That's the highest funding in history. And we're very, very proud of our persistent advocacy efforts at Legacies. And for Cambodia, that's 9 million. For Vietnam, 19 million. All 3 countries have seen increases. However, there's still much work to be done. This year, the CWD, or Conventional Weapons Destruction Account, is facing a proposed $20 million cut, and we cannot allow this to happen. I'm thankful to Congresswoman Spear and Congressman Johnson for leading the Humanitarian Demining letter, which outlines the importance of continued US investment in global demining efforts. This includes continued funding for Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Legacies and our partners, MAG, HALO, Peace Trees, and Apopo have been urging supporters to join us and take 10 seconds, just 10 seconds to write to your members of Congress. You can do this by going to Legacy social media and following the easy instruction, which my team is dropping right now. Humanitarian demining efforts are important, and I hope you will take action and help us. Now, today's discussion is really around just the lingering dangers of UXO on the environment. So I'll touch on just 3 ways that explosive remnants of war negatively impacts the environment. And I'll reference my colleague Doug's website, Conflict and Environment Observatory, as well as the Mine Action Review report. So there are 3 different ways that it negatively impacts the environment. The first is soil degradation. When a bomb is detonated and explodes, it shatters the soil's structure and damages the stability. This causes local compaction and increases the soil's susceptibility to erosion. Soil is a living ecosystem, and it's a finite resource. It can take up to 1,000 years to generate just 3 centimeters of topsoil. The second is hazardous chemical. When a bomb is detonated, it releases harmful toxin pollutants such as TNT and other munition components like heavy metal into the air and land. As ordnance degrades over time, the casing can corrode and chemical can seep into groundwater. Depending on factors like soil types, climate, type of munition, this can take anywhere between 10 to 90 years for explosive to leach from an ordnance. In Laos right now, most of the bombs are nearly 50 years old. So you can imagine the impact that it has on the environment and people. This is the third one is something that isn't touched on as much, and there really needs to be a lot more research done on this. But when an explosive ordnance is detonated, it can trigger forest fires, and then these fires can cause more ordnance to explode. So the impact can be multiplied and negatively impacts the environment around that area as well as the people. One thing that is sort of a positive as well as not so positive. I mean, nothing about unexploded ordnance is positive, but I will like to highlight one last example, and that is Norwegian Peoples Aid, which is a humanitarian demining organization that's in Laos. And they've been in Laos since 1997. And since NPA has been in Laos, they've cleared over 17 million square meters of land, and that benefits about a little over 65,000 people living in Laos. This is a very small team that could use more funding. There's about 335 national staff on NPA's team. But I've had the privilege of having to have a couple of conversations with Catherine Harrison, who is the program coordinator in Laos. And, you know, I'll just quote her really quickly. Catherine writes in a blog on NPA's website, which my team will also be dropping. Protection of the environment is something we want to keep actively towards and improve in our operations. The basis for work must always be the principle that the activities we carry out must not harm people or the environment. And, you know, this is a quote from a blog that, that is on NPA's website, and it really talks about how in order to clear these bombs, in order to just do mining work, the team, you know, the team has to cut down vegetation, which also causes soil degradation, which is something that they must do in order to remove these bombs. But, you know, what I really admire about NPA's work is they're being super thoughtful about how their overall impacts, you know, while they're trying to clean up bombs, they also know that they're contaminating the land by just doing some of the work and by some of the rubbish and garbage that is produced from the team doing the work, right? So since 2019, NPA's just started this movement to go greener. And one of the best things that Catherine shared with me is last autumn, they teamed up with Zero Waste Laos, which is a small nonprofit organization in Laos. And really, I like to think of them as a movement, and a movement by the youth in Laos who really, really knows how environmental impact, how it is so important to focus on environmental impact to the land as well as to the people. So Zero Waste Laos arranged a full day seminar for all of NPA's staff. And here they learn like good methods for recycling, minimizing waste as they're doing clearance work. They even set up their own home composting. And this is something that, you know, I really admire, and how all of the demining teams in Laos has really looked at what can we do, you know, in addition to removing these bombs, how can we minimize our impact on the environment? And this is one that I think is such a great example, and I hope other teams take notes from NPA. So to conclude, to my knowledge, there has yet to be any studies or testing done specifically on the soil in Laos and how explosive ordnance have impacted the environment. I hope our discussion today will help inform and inspire interest from experts as well as funders to look at Laos as a possible place for a research project. And I know there's even interest within this group, Aaron, to do just that. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And on that note of research, let's turn to Aaron. Aaron?
Awesome, thank you. So I'm a political scientist, and I study the long run impacts of war on development, particularly focusing on bombing. I look at specifically how unexploded ordnance left over from the Vietnam War has this corrosive effect on agricultural development in Cambodia. And I really appreciate going after Sarah because I think she really highlighted very well just some of the stats about the casualties and the effect of unexploded ordnance on people's everyday lives. And pointed out this interesting trend over time about how casualties and injuries are decreasing in the past few decades from injuries from unexploded ordnance. But what I'm going to also point out there is that unexploded ordnance can still impact local economies and still create poverty traps that limit farmers from actually engaging in commercial agricultural production and joining the middle class. How does this work exactly? Well, farmers usually consider themselves lucky if they're able to till fertile soil. But this type of land, particularly in Cambodia, often signifies danger rather than abundance. What do I mean by this? Well, the US dropped over 2 million tons of bombs on Cambodia during the Vietnam War. This is in an effort to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is the supply lines and mobile bases built by the North Vietnamese and National Liberation Front that ran through the eastern half of Cambodia and Laos. I find in my research that the bombs that fell on the kind of flinty hard soil, that generally detonated, whereas the ones that landed on the softer earth did not. Now, no one really knows how many bombs remain in rich soil, even though in another paper I had done, I had collaborated with a computer scientist where we looked at high resolution satellite images and linked that with reports from a mine action group and estimated that in this particular village with medium fertility soil, about 50% of the munitions remain unexploded. In my own independent research, I show that the US bombardment injured not only Cambodia's people, but its economy as well. And I did this in a combination of methods. So first I relied on ethnographic observation and qualitative interviews. And I just talked to a bunch of farmers living in Cambodia, who are the ones who said that they thought that the richer, darker soil presented this unusually high risk of hidden ordnance, especially in heavily bombed areas. And these farmers work in constant fear of explosions. So as a result, some only plant crops on parts of their farms that they're confident contained no bombs, and others use just hand tools instead of machines so they could reduce the risk of detonation. I then quantified this behavior using agricultural and census records to produce village and farm level estimates of investment in their farms, productivity, household income, and soil quality. And then I mapped that data to the precise sites of American bombing. So after I made adjustments for factors like rice prices and differences between regions and economic conditions before the war, I found that areas in relatively barren earth, there is actually no relationship between these two variables, that being like historical bombardment does not affect farmers' methods in such places that are kind of less fertile, because bombs that hit rocky ground almost always exploded. However, in regions where there's rich soil, the aerial attacks from 50 years ago make a measurable difference today in contemporary production. So among farms in these fertile areas, those in places that were bombed are unusually unproductive. I estimate that the share of land planted with crops in these areas is about 12% lower in these farms than in others located in similarly fruitful regions that were spared by American bombing. And then this shrinks harvests. So this actually reduces by half the amount of rice that owners have left over to sell after feeding themselves. And then this cuts household incomes by 40%. So there's a few main takeaways to kind of absorb from this. And the first thing I wanted to highlight is that bombing is actually this composite intervention. So some bombs explode on impact, but others do not. And as kind of areas of study, these locations with many leftover bombs are as important as areas that took heavy damage from successfully exploded bombs. Now, historically, our attention is typically focused on the immediate victims of airstrikes, but I argue that we need to expand our attention to study people who continue to navigate these gray spaces between danger and safety. The second thing I wanted to highlight is that unexploded ordnance adds immense physical risk to daily agricultural activities. And it essentially makes the most fertile land, at least in Cambodia, the least productive because it's so dangerous to farm. So this is really this odd reversal of fortune because the very best land continues to be held hostage by war. And another way of thinking about this is that it actually removes the fertility advantage of high fertility soil, making it as productive as low fertility soil in Cambodia. The last thing that I wanted to say is that living with unexploded bombs is socially transformative. So when bomb fuses fail and bombs disappear into agricultural land, a lot of these rural households are left to deal with the dangers of unexploded ordnance by themselves. And since these bombs are hidden in the ground and no one knows exactly where they are or how many of them are still present, just rumors of finding a single cluster bomb can single-handedly trigger what I call a sphere of fear that is actually much larger than what a bomb's immediate blast radius would be. So this fear actually turns confident farmers into cautious ones, and it may be turning thousands of potential farmers away from dreams of commercial agricultural production toward the reality of farming minimally only at the subsistence level. So it's really important to think about these changes in total, because over the span of 50 years, these short-term adjustments in agricultural practices accumulate, and they can lead to long-term underproduction and poverty. So in conclusion, I think these findings, they're just testament to the horror of bombing, and like not only in the immediate anguish that followed, but its signature can still be detected today in today's agricultural development and in today's civilian lives.
Thank you. Excellent. And now our fourth panelist, Doug.
Great. Thank you, Charles. Just to say thank you to the Stimson Centre and the War Legacies Working Group for the invitation to contribute to this session. So just very briefly, CEOBS, we were founded to take advantage of the new remote tools that allow us to monitor the environmental dimensions of conflicts and military activities. For us, this is data which is vital for informing the immediate response and also for advocacy in favour of enhanced protection. And then for the last few years, we partnered with MPA on promoting environmental mainstreaming in the mine action sector, and it's been fantastic to see this take off. I'm going to step back a little bit from Southeast Asia before, I guess, looping back, I suppose. So as the previous speakers have indicated, when we think about the environmental legacies of war, we tend to conceptualize these as either direct or indirect harms. The direct, easily understandable, or maybe we might want to call them the physical harms to the environment, include the direct consequences of how wars are fought, where they're fought, and by whom. So, for example, a decision to target a major oil refinery and the air, water, and soil pollution that it leaves behind. However, the indirect, reverberating, or cascading environmental consequences are not always as straightforward to understand or as predictable. So, for example, a strategy of destroying formal oil infrastructure that was contributing to the financing of an opponent or supporting its war effort creates localized pollution, a hotspot of pollution around that site. But it doesn't destroy the demand for fuel, for heating, or for transport among local communities. So instead, they turn to highly polluting artisanal oil refining, creating pollution and health problems over a much wider area. Another example of indirect harms are those that stem from the impact of conflict on environmental governance. So, and this is something we're seeing in Ukraine right now, at a local level, activists may be forced to flee the fighting and they'll cease the environmental projects they were working on. At a national level, the government no longer has the capacity or focus to address environmental problems. It may not have access to affected areas. And this is at a time when the environment is obviously under particularly acute pressure as a result of the conflict. At an international level, we might see donors curtailing funding to programs in that country over security fears, or has been the case of the invasion of Ukraine. We see geopolitical tensions impacting international processes on multilateral environmental agreements. So, for example, you could think of the ambition from COP26 which has been knocked off the headlines. We've seen 2 IPCC reports come out, which have elicited barely any response in the papers, or at least far less than they would have done had the papers not been dominated by Ukraine. And the impact of this weakening or loss of governance can last for years. I suppose another way of considering the environmental legacy of war is also from a legal perspective. So the legal framework intended to protect the environment in war is extremely permissive, and compliance is very poor. Legal precedents for reparations or cleanup are very few, and even the system of post-conflict environmental assessment and assistance is ad hoc. The result of this is that we see very high levels of environmental damage and conflict that often remain unaddressed. And this has consequences for human health, ecosystems, economies, and increasingly climate vulnerability. In the last decade, efforts have been ongoing to strengthen the legal framework. We've seen the International Committee of the Red Cross updating its environmental guidelines for militaries during conflicts, although the underlying international humanitarian law remains largely the same. Over the next few months, the United Nations International Law Commission will complete the largest overhaul of the legal framework since after the Vietnam War. And in the autumn this year, the UN General Assembly is expected to adopt the 28 legal principles covering environmental protection before, during, and after armed conflicts and in situations of occupation that the International Law Commission has been developing. Their project is aimed to progressively develop, codify, or evolutionarily interpret norms from IHL, human rights law, and environmental law to create a new framework for protection. However, many states remain opposed to this goal, and much of the framework will be non-binding, and it still lacks an implementation mechanism. So, to conclude, as a society, we are more environmentally aware than ever before. We also have a far deeper understanding of the relationship between conflict and the environment. The legal framework has sought to catch up, but we still have a very long way to go before environmental harm in conflicts is reduced and its impacts fully addressed. I'll leave it there, Charles. Thank you.
Thank you. Very excellent statements. We'll now turn to some questions in the same order for Claire. Claire, your organization, Peace Trees Vietnam, and others are adept at both preventing and responding to the sudden and unpredicted loss of livelihoods and family disruption from a UXO accident. How can Peace Trees apply this same expertise when whole communities suffer sudden and unpredicted loss of livelihoods due to extreme heat, rainfall, flooding, landslips, landslides, and other impacts of climate change?
Thank you for the question. As my colleagues illustrated very well over the last few minutes, the impact of the presence of unexploded ordnance and other war legacy impacts have a very long-lasting impact on communities that evolves over time. Many years ago, and even up to maybe about 5 years ago, unexploded ordnance accidents were very frequent in the areas where we work and across the region, much more so than they are now. In fact, Peace Trees, like our colleagues at MAG and NPA, at least, and Project Renew in Vietnam, had whole arms of our organizations working to provide survivor assistance and victims assistance in the incidents of loss of life or injury from ordnance. That has changed, and fortunately there are many fewer accidents now. And the most recent accident, sadly though, was in February. Man was performing maintenance on his kitchen and dug his shovel into the ground and encountered a piece of ordnance and was killed on impact. So although the frequency of accidents has gone down, the severity of them has not. And this very random accident that took place after so many years of no accidents or very few accidents, even regionally, illustrates how essential explosive ordnance risk education remains and how essential and random the impacts can be in this region. Peace Trees deminers and demining organizations, war legacy organizations working in this whole region are very uniquely positioned to reach rural, difficult to reach communities, because that's where we're providing ordnance removal. And so as are looking ahead into the future, as climate impacts are felt more and more. There are a few ways where we can take our years of experience working deep in community with our partner communities and partner organizations that we can take to inform good quality assistance in those situations. The first is strong relationships with communities and local leadership. It has been Peachtree's experience, and I would gather experience of other colleague organizations, that really close communication and collaboration with the government and very local governments can foster good quality assistance in the case of environmental disasters. For example, in 2020, we can all remember the flooding that took place in Southeast Asia, the terrible storms that impacted the communities for weeks. In that instance, our demining operations were paused immediately, and our teams transformed into first responders. And they were able to do that because they have such experience day in, day out, going into very difficult to reach communities that would be difficult to reach through the main infrastructure. And also in some cases when infrastructure was washed out, Peachtree's teams were able to actually get there using other routes because of their level of familiarity. The second is that we have experience working as a hybrid organization. Peachtree's not only assists with the humanitarian mine action, we also assist communities in returning land to productive use. And it's really the opposite of working at scale. We actually are working as locally as possible, knowing that community-led development is very close to the ground, individualized by community sort of effort. And to bring that experience working close in with communities to bear on the kind of support we can provide in instances of extreme weather and other climate related crises. And finally, the presence of ordnance is widespread. And as organizations and local leadership continue to work on climate change adaptation, we know that mine risk education, mining operations will be important in supporting those efforts. And I think Peachtree's and our colleague organizations would be well served to take a focus on our role as supporters of environmental efforts taking place either by our other colleague organizations or by our partner governments.
Thank you, Claire. Your point about incidence has dropped, but the severity is not as well taken, and illustrated with that tragic story of the man fixing his kitchen and suddenly he's dead. Let me turn to Sarah. Sarah, in 2015, world leaders adopted 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, at a UN summit. The SDGs set targets to be achieved by 2030 on a series of global challenges like climate change, poverty, and disadvantage. But there is also an 18th Sustainable Development Goal, Lives Safe from UXO. Can you tell us about this? How can Laos, how can SDG 18 be a springboard for global UXO action at Laos?
Yeah, thanks for bringing up the SDGs, Charles. You know, for as you mentioned, you know, this is a very, very unique SDG or Sustainable Development Goal that Laos is the only country that has an 18th goal in addition to the 17 that's set by the United Nations and world leaders, and that have been adopted. You know, these range anywhere from like poverty to climate change to inequality and justice. But Laos's 18th goal, Lives Safe from UXO, outlines 4 different things that the government of Laos adopted. The first is to ensure that casualties from UXO are eliminated to the extent possible. And 2, to ensure residual UXO activities undertaken and all known UXO contaminations in high priority areas are cleared. This really includes just contamination that's caused to the environment as well as people, right? The third is that survivors and victims have needs met in health and in livelihood. And health can also mean mental and physical health. The fourth one is to ensure that all activities related to UXO are fully funded. I think this is not only significant, but very unique and ambitious, extremely ambitious, and will require greater support from international community to achieve its success. So, I would highlight two things that the global community can do. And the first really is funding. Funding needs to be sustained. We have to really commit to this, and especially as Americans, these are American ordinances, and we have to take bolder steps and just say that we're going to be with the people of Laos until the job is done. Other governments can also join in, and there are many other governments that have lent support to Laos, such as, the UK, Ireland, Japan, but more needs to really look at this and really help. And I urge more to invest and just to commit to just being with Laos, being with a partner and getting the job done. If funding is not an option, sharing knowledge and expertise can go a long way, right? There needs to be more research done on just the impacts of these contamination on the environment and people and water. Cleanup, technological innovations for the demining sector, always welcome. And, I just want to highlight one person who I've met in Laos. His name is Ray Vogler, who still to this day, Ray, if you're watching, thanks for always sending me new technology that you see, such as like using drones to map out different areas that may not be as easy to get into. Like Laos has a lot of mountains, a lot of forests, a lot of places where it could take, you might have to take a boat and then walk and then find a bike to get to, right? So all these are helpful things. And I would urge any new methodologies, to be shared, to really, really just try to help us get the work done more efficient, faster, so that we don't have to think that this is a problem that would take hundreds of years to resolve. Really, this can take 10 years, I believe it can, if we all pour our resources into it.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. This is a particularly important point, that let's not forget that the ordinance is US ordinance, but it's heartening that there is more money coming from the US. And I might add, this also encourages humanitarian assistance from other countries as well that previously might have backed off for a variety of political reasons. So I hope that we're on a roll here, and your call for research is certainly an important one, and we can talk about that more. Turn now to Aaron. Aaron, your concept of where the bombs fall in Cambodia, on the one hand falling on hard rocks, and on the other falling in the equivalent of a soft pillow, disappearing from sight and basically condemning for the indefinite future large areas of land as unusable or risky and dangerous. In Vietnam and Laos, a lot of the bombing was in mountainous areas. But in Vietnam, as we've heard, in Quang Tri province, there's been a lot of progress in both mine awareness and also mine action, in the sense of local teams, that when someone is undertaking some project, they try to clear the area, first, or at least surveil the area and clear it from UXO. Can you tell us about two things? First of all, how your concepts might be applied in new research in Laos and Cambodia. And secondly, what about these areas of rich agricultural soils in Cambodia? I assume that they're flat and accessible to roads. Has there been successful clearing in these areas? And if so, what does it take?
Great questions. I'm going to take them in reverse order. So this question, I think Charles, your second question actually speaks a lot to what are the differences in terrain across these three parts of Southeast Asia. And in Cambodia, yes, it's known to be a much flatter area in the Mekong Delta, where a lot of the fertile areas are these kind of inundated plains. Yes, it's also true that in Vietnam and Laos there's more mountain ranges, and I've spoken to people on the ground in both of those areas, and it does seem like where there is more mountains, where you find higher elevation, you actually find more duds, but you also find more like terraced padding as well. So it's people are still making a living trying to farm. But the conditionality on the terrain type will be slightly different, likely. But it's really, I hope to in some ways motivate more researchers to pursue questions like this and see what types of terrains in the places that they study are they going to find more mechanical failures of these particular bombs. I think your question about like to what degree do these findings generalize elsewhere? It actually speaks to one of the questions too that I saw in the Q&A, which is, how can we take some of these findings within Southeast Asia that might seem kind of historically frozen in time based on the technologies that the US Air Force had, 50, 60 years ago? How do we extend them to places that are experiencing war today? Particularly when people are hearing stories of things like drone warfare and precision guided munitions. To what degree do these types of technologies leave unexploded ordnance? And I think one thing that I just want to point out is that despite our military innovations in things like precision guided munitions and in real-time tracking with satellite data, it is still highly likely, and in fact has happened, that other areas are going to be cluster bombed. So first, I just wanted to point out that the US still maintains an arsenal of over 2 million cluster munitions in the US and 1.5 million abroad. And the last confirmed US airstrike that involved cluster munitions took place in 2009 in Yemen. But actually, in 2016, there was a Saudi aerial attack of Yemen that found the latest generation of US manufactured cluster bombs from the Raytheon company. And that arms manufacturer actually had signed a deal in the Trump administration to provide, the latest generation of cluster munitions to the Saudis, even though that deal was actually begun by the Obama administration. It has been paused by the Biden administration currently, but it's just a pause, and there's actually no guarantee if we are not going to restart that. So I think like when we kind of take a step back and think about like where cluster munitions are they still being used? In fact, they are. And we need to really think about, if we are allowing American manufacturers to sell cluster munitions abroad, then we should really treat unexploded ordnance as this enduring political problem deserving of not only continued study and attention, but of, continuing discussion of what our obligation is as American citizens to convey that to the politicians that we put in office. And really treat this problem kind of as this contemporary issue rather than this one-off historical phenomenon.
I think that's a very fine point. It is a contemporary issue, but can you just circle back to the status of mine action and clearance in these rural areas?
Yes, I answered a question that you didn't even ask.
Those are often the best answers.
So I spent over a year living in Cambodia as a graduate student, and then had returned back to Cambodia as a professor living there over the summers. And so one summer, I actually lived in the border of Cambodia, Vietnam, and just accompanied a humanitarian demining group over the course of 3 months. And one of the things I noticed when I kind of was just this, like, I wouldn't want to say fangirl of the team, is that the explosive ordnance disposal team, like they run a hotline where, villagers can just call in anytime they just unearth a bomb and they need help detonating it. And so the hotline was probably getting 2 to 3 dozen calls a week of people finding bombs. But they're usually only able to do a site visit, probably 1 or 2 site visits per day. And that's just because, this is still Cambodia, where a lot of the roads that we're going on, especially to access some of these villages, they're still dirt. It's really hard to cross a lot of these roads during wet season. I mean, there's potholes everywhere. And the process of safely, locating and detonating ordnance it still takes time. And so we can usually only take care of a fraction of the calls that we get in. And I think it just highlights the need to increase the amount of funding so there's more explosive ordnance disposal teams so they can actually meet the local demand. And this is just the stuff that is being unearthed by the civilians themselves. I mean, I think there's also the obligation that we have to actually go to areas where a lot of civilians are too scared to go to clear that, which also tends to be some of the most fertile parts of Cambodia. And so I think like this little anecdote just shows that, you know, the explosive ordnance disposal team is only able to cover a small fraction of what's being reported, and what's being reported is only a small fraction of the land that's being contaminated.
Okay, thank you. That gives a very clear picture. And Doug, can you tell us a little bit more about the framework the UN International Law Commission is developing for protection of the environment during armed conflicts? What principles in its among the 28 speak specifically to the kind of environmental legacies we've seen in Southeast Asia?
Yeah, thanks, Charles. Yeah, where to begin? So it's been a bit of a marathon. They've been working on this for around 10 years, although the process was triggered in 2009 with a report which the UN Environment Programme, DC-based Environmental Law Institute and Red Cross put together, which looked at the weakness of the existing legal framework, and much of that was based on the law which came, international humanitarian law, which came out of the war in Southeast Asia. There were some principles in there that the environment should be protected against widespread, long-term or severe effects, but there was no real agreement on what they actually meant in practice. And it was clear that most of the damage which we had seen and which we see in most conflicts fall underneath this threshold. Over the years, there's kind of been opportunity to develop it a bit more, but it was clear from 2009 onwards that there were components of human rights law, right to a healthy environment, for example, and environmental law, which also still applied during conflict. And more to the point, as we've been hearing, it's not just about the conflict itself, it's about post-conflict, significantly about post-conflict in the case of Southeast Asia and, you know, Iraq and elsewhere, but also steps that could be taken before conflicts, and then also what happens in situations of occupation. So the International Law Commission, which advises the UN General Assembly on the progressive development and codification of international law, picked up this topic back in 2013. And for a start, they said, well, look, the law which we're going to develop and the principles we're going to come up with, they're going to apply to both international armed conflicts and non-international armed conflicts. That's completely new. Protection in non-international armed conflicts, the majority of conflicts globally, is extremely underdeveloped. They also said, well, look, as I said, you know, international humanitarian law, which applies during conflicts, isn't the only legal regime which is relevant. So we're going to bring in these other bodies of law, and not just law, but also state practice and the practice of international organizations. And then they're creating this suite of principles, which are super varied. You know, there's around 28 of them currently. There may be 29, 30 by the time they finish. Some of these, I'll talk about some of the ones which are relevant, I guess, to the experience of Southeast Asia. But this week in Geneva, they're getting into their final round of talks before these principles will go to the UN General Assembly in the autumn, hopefully for adoption. So a chunk of these apply to the post-conflict stage. So for example, in there is a principle on post-conflict environmental assessments. So you should go in and assess the environment post-conflict. There is a principle on remnants of war, which is very much informed by the Mine Ban Treaty, by the Convention on Cluster Munitions, by CCW Protocol 5. But it's not just about explosive remnants of war. It's framed as toxic and hazardous remnants of war. So it would also apply to Agent Orange, depleted uranium, oil pollution, which we see in most conflicts. There's a principle in there on state responsibility, which reflects international law standards around how that's worked out, but it also reinforces the fact that there should be accountability for environmental damage to the environment in and of itself, not just something which is owned by humans, for example. So looking at how ecosystems can be damaged and compensated for. And there's also a principle on relief and assistance for people who are affected by environmental harm, looking at different ways that they could be assisted, which builds on the kind of principle of victim assistance in disarmament law and Mine Ban Treaty and others. So these have had a huge role in kind of influencing and framing some of the principles within the ILC's process, which would hopefully conclude this year. And it's the biggest deal the biggest deal for legal protection of the environment in conflicts since the late 70s, but it's also completely under the radar at the moment.
Thank you very much. We have such a wealth of experience here that we could go on, but we now want to turn to our audience, and some questions are coming in through the Q&A. One question is, and these questions are addressed to all four panelists, so whoever wishes to respond, please do so. Our first question is, would land reclaimed from Agent Orange and UXOs be enough to offset land losses from climate change in Southeast Asia? This is a kind of hypothetical one, but Aaron and Claire, would you, possibly Sarah, do you have any thoughts on this? Try to get some idea of what the actual asset value is of the land that is contaminated, particularly from UXOs, and its relation to land loss and climate change.
I'll start off by saying I'm looking forward to hearing from colleagues, especially you, Aaron, on this question. I think that my biggest concern around that approach is the uncertainty involved. We don't know truly how much land stands to be reclaimed, and we are, as you know, Sarah put very well in her opening remarks, a very long way from understanding the true breadth of impact, because there's so much work left to be done. That said, I'm really curious about the promise in this question, so hopefully colleagues will be able to speak to that.
I can try to take a stab next. I'm always cautious to think of things as like a cost benefit analysis in terms of like, well, will the land we get back from clearance, will that make up for climate change loss? And I think climate change is also such a tricky issue because it encapsulates so much of types of land degradation occurring within Southeast Asia. And I think like one of the dangers of potentially just thinking in this kind of like give up some land, get some land back approach is that it almost makes us like not think of all the nuance of like all of this kind of downstream effects that unexploded ordnance have on societies. And so I think a couple of examples is, well, one main one actually that I still don't quite know what the best response would be to this is that I think you can kind of go to a panel like this and think, okay, what we need to do is that we need to increase our funding for, you know, humanitarian mine action. And like, that will probably be the best case approach. But what I found through some of my ethnographic observation is that even if you examine some of the villages where they've, you know, the majority of their fields have been demined, there are still a lot of issues that have been caused by the unexploded ordnance that like we might be responsible for fixing as well. So one problem of concern is that, you know, unexploded ordnance, they actually almost create this dark halo around the farmers' land, because even though the land is very dangerous to the farmers themselves, in Cambodia, it's a authoritarian country in which there's a lot of predatory elites grabbing land from farmers. And so while unexploded ordnance exists, it actually prevents farmers from their land from being grabbed. When that land is cleared, it's kind of like throwing them out of the firing pan into the fire. Like then they all of a sudden are like oftentimes victims of land grabs because they're in this situation of very weak property rights. And so there is this question that we now need to think of is like, to what degree does humanitarian demining need to be linked to other types of programming so that like, you know, we take all of this care and put all this money into trying to help, you know, individual farming households. But we might not be helping them in the end if in the end their land gets stolen from them so quickly. So I think in some ways, like just there needs to be more research on this to quantify the problem and to show that it's just more than like one-off anecdotes. And then we need to think more programmatically with other organizations in terms of how do we support these types of farmers so that they can actually enjoy the land that they own without fear of having it taken from them in the future.
Thank you. We have several questions which I will club together under the heading of sort of U.S. awareness. Our panelists finding that media and political attention the humanitarian costs of the current war, are people more open to your messages about legacies of the US war in Indochina? Or are they less interested about responsibilities for the past? I guess maybe I rephrase this by just saying, what do Americans think about unexploded ordnance and war legacies now that we have a hot war right on our doorstep? Who would like to, Doug, would you like to, you have a perspective from being in Manchester, UK.
Yeah, I guess for us actually, it's been quite interesting to see the level of media interest. I mean, you cited that Wall Street Journal piece at the start of the session, but it's been heartening in some respects to see how much media interest there has been in the environmental dimensions of the conflict in Ukraine. In some respects, it's like a continuation of what's been going on in eastern Ukraine for the last 8 years in terms of this risks from industrial sites, but also actually being able to sort of bring in and link in these problems. So, for example, looking specifically at Russian strategy of targeting of the use of explosive force in these urbanized areas, which have very high levels of industrialization and the environmental risks that creates. It's also been quite heartening to see how many journalists have been asking us about greenhouse gas emissions and climate change and the link to conflict there. So I think in these cases where you do have a hot war, it can trigger interest and can get people to start asking these questions. And I think we've certainly seen from the history of a legal framework around conflict in the environment that it's times like this where you actually get progress on these things. So not to say that we should cynically leverage these things, but make the best use of the media interest and political attention at the time to try and move forward across issues on all of the topics that we work on, I think.
Well, thank you very much. I see that we are at it's 7 minutes past the hour. Let me hand it back to Brian and Courtney, as I think we have finished basically the questions specifically about UXO that came up in the Q&A.
Charles, we've got time. We're going to go to 10:15 or 15 past the hour.
15 past the hour. Okay.
Charles, I like to take a stab at that, and thank you, John, for asking that question. You know, a couple of things I want to flag. Like first, the American Secret War in Laos is still not widely known, and this is why Legacies exists. You know, we're a twofold organization. One, we seek to educate the American public about the American Secret War, and two, we want to advocate for funding for the removal of these bombs. And yes, you know, cluster bombs being used in Ukraine has definitely inspired a lot more interest in this issue, but it's really focused on what's happening in Ukraine. But I love what Aaron mentioned, that this is contemporary. If there are still victims and people impacted by it, this is a contemporary issue. And I just want to flag one thing that just really inspiring that just happened is that Congresswoman Sarah Jacobs, along with Congressman Keating and Congressman McGovern, have issued a letter to President Biden urging the ban of cluster bombs and the destruction of all the stockpiles in the arsenal, and urging like the president to also take bold action and commit the U.S. to joining the Convention on Cluster Munition. And this is something that, you know, my colleagues and I with U.S. CBL-CMC, or the U.S. Campaign to Ban Landmine Cluster Munition Coalition, which Legacy serves as a steering committee member of, has been pushing for years. And I think, you know, with just everything that's happening in the world, with all the attention that this unfortunate war is having in the media's eyes, is that we should really wake up and know that these weapons, once they're dropped, they kill then and they kill now, and they're indiscriminate, meaning that they cannot differentiate between a 6-year-old child walking to school or a combatant. So the US need to really commit to this, and just join the hundreds of other countries that have already banned these weapons. The second thing that I'll add too is that there has been a lot of interest, and in particular from many students who are doing research on this armament issue, on just war, right? Like, and in particular on the American Secret War, because it is not in American textbooks. And this is really the only place that they can come to is Legacy's website. And we get a lot of emails calling for just more information, right? And many of which are still classified. You know, and I would really be remiss if I didn't mention that this is the reason why Legacies has launched our Legacies Library, which is a free resource on our website. And folks can go there to learn more about the history of the American Secret War, as well as what we are doing to really push for more funding and how folks can join it. So thank you, John, for that question.
Thank you. We have time for a final question. We've been talking primarily about legacies of war, not toxic legacies of normal military operations. This question is directed to Doug and asks for comment or to talk to us about how regular military training and operations are contributing to toxic pollution and carbon emissions.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Paul. Yeah, it's interesting. I think, you know, we saw the International Law Commission take this temporal approach to protection of the environment in relation to armed conflicts, acknowledging that stuff happens before conflict and after conflicts. And in terms of the day-to-day military preparation and upkeep of armed forces, it's a huge drain on resources. It's a huge financial drain. You know, you see the Defense Authorization Act in the US, the amount of money, $800 billion for next year towards US military spending. And all of that spending comes with an environmental footprint, be it in terms of resource use, be it in terms of toxic waste generated, or increasingly around emissions. And this is an area where we've seen quite a lot of shift in this sort of last 18 months, 2 years, with NATO and others recognizing the carbon footprint of their operations and the need to address it. And it's been quite heartening, I think, to see this kind of shift, which, you know, I spoke earlier about the level of environmental awareness currently in society. You know, we've been talking about environmental mainstream in the mine action community, which has been developing very quickly, environmental mainstream in humanitarian organizations, and we're also increasingly seeing it within the military. Obviously, there are limits in terms of what militaries can do because the nature of their work tends to be quite environmentally damaging, but it's better to reduce it and address it as best we can. And I think particularly when we look at the massive levels of spending in the US, for example, you know, US military DoD emissions are far greater than around 140 individual countries. And then when you factor in the supply chains necessary for the military, that may be 3 to 5 times more emissions. And all sectors of society are increasingly going to have to play their part in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and militaries can't be exempt from that. The US is somewhat further ahead than most of the rest of the world, but there's going to be increasing attention on this. So I think we need to start looking at this in the wider sort of temporal scope, I think, and it's important that we do, and it's important for militaries who can provide some leadership on environmental issues at times, but only once they have their own house in order.
Thank you. I recall years ago that there was some public outcry over the US military using a small island off Puerto Rico for bombing runs, which was brought to an end. Similarly, a long time ago, the idea that undersea, deep sea communication with submarines could be done by putting very low frequency wiring under Lake Superior, also, which was never happened. I see that we are at our appointed endpoint. There's one question about a strongly recommended reading, and rather than take time here, let me suggest that you visit the websites of these organizations as well as the War Legacies Working Group website. And if for the questioner about Agent Orange, my website at the Aspen Institute. So back to you, Brian and Courtney.
Thank you, Charles, and many thanks to all the panelists for this enlightening discussion. Again, as someone who works at the intersection of the environment and war legacies issues, I think you've given us a lot of food for thought, our program, in fact, for approaching these issues in the region. In fact, my Slack channel was busy talking to our data guy, Reagan, Kwan about how to take some of what we learned and put it to use in some new things that we're developing to help visualize the legacies of war and their impacts on the environment. Again, thank you all for joining us. This is an event of the War Legacies Working Group, a membership-based working group that addresses the legacies of war and seeks to bring more resources to solving these really critically important problems. Look forward to our next event, and thank you again for attending.